Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everybody. We are pleased to welcome you to the third webinar of the 2024 edition of the Data Collection webinar series that's organized by the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF headquarters. My name is Archana Dovedi, and I work with the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF. Before we get started, I'd like to just review some of the housekeeping rules. We have scheduled about an hour and 30 minutes today, including Q&A. Throughout the webinar, please remain muted and kindly write your questions in the Q&A box, which will be made available towards the end of the presentation. We will then try and group your questions and direct them to the presenter during the Q&A session. As always, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MICS YouTube channel together with past webinars. The recording will also be made available on the UNICEF SharePoint site. You can find the links to both in the announcement that you received. Now I'll introduce Attila Hansyoglu, who is the Chief of the Data Collection Unit and the Global Coordinator of MICS at UNICEF headquarters. Attila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Archana, and hello to everyone once again. We are pleased to have all of you on this webinar. This is the third webinar of the 2024 edition of our Data Collection webinar series. The Data Collection Unit at UNICEF headquarters is organizing these webinars. We made a change in this series of the webinars. This time we are focusing mostly or exclusively almost on the multiple indicator cluster surveys program. During the course of this webinar series, we will be delving into different aspects of MICS implementation at country level, innovations in MICS, the exploration of new modules, tools, and features, as well as explore various household survey facets during the webinars. We are doing these webinars about every 2 weeks on Wednesdays from 8 a.m. to 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. So today's webinar is entitled "How Good Are Response Rates in Mainstream Household Survey Programs? A retrospective analysis of MICS and DHS surveys since the 1990s." So today we have with us Pierre Martel as our main presenter. Pierre is one of the senior household survey experts who works with the MICS program, and he's going to be presenting the findings of this work that he has completed. As something slightly different, we will do something slightly different today, which is that I will come in at the beginning of the slides for 3 slides, I think. I will do an introduction to how we started to do this work, why we started it, what the issue is, what the problem is, and describe a little bit the work that we have done. And then I will leave the floor to Pierre to come in and talk about the findings of the work that he has been doing. So can I start, Archana, if we are all ready? We have the full screen now. So as we mentioned, we are looking at response rates in mainstream household survey programs, and we are using the MICS and DHS surveys since the 1990s for this analysis. Next slide. So as many of you know, a common perception among both survey practitioners as well as data users is that response rates in household surveys have been declining over time, with the obvious concern that this might be leading to distorted survey results. For instance, on the screen we are showing the title of an economist from The Economist from 2018, which talks about not even declining response rates, but plunging response rates, that the plunging response rates to household surveys are worrying policymakers, and they're having to rely more on other sources of data. Next slide. A simple Google, for instance, will show you that this is very prevalent in the literature and in the media. that household surveys have declining response rates. We have included a paragraph from a National Research Council publication, which is about non-response in social science surveys, published back in 2013. So it's not even new. I can assure you that if you look into the literature and the publications and the media, you will see that this perception that household survey response rates have been plunging is actually even getting more common these days. These concerns, of course, and we'll see whether they're real or they apply to DHS and MICS surveys. These concerns have actually led to a sizable literature on studying non-response behavior in general. For instance, through looking at characteristics of non-responders, to reweighting, to calibration, doing imputation to reduce bias due to both unit non-response and item non-response. And by the way, in this work that you will see, we're concentrating on unit non-response, not item non-response. And also there has been efforts to put in place special measures such as targeted campaigns. But all of these concerns overall have been creating a bad reputation for household surveys. And we wanted to look into whether this concern is justified for all kinds of household surveys, and if so, where and how and when. If you go to the next slide. So with all of this in mind, we set out to check the trends in response rates in these two household survey programs and to see if there's really cause for concern how the response rates have been changing, if any, over time. And we started looking at, Pierre started looking at, doing the main analysis to see whether there are special groups, whether response rates are declining in urban areas, but not in rural areas, in different income groups, etc. And I will leave the floor now to Pierre to take us through the findings. I will try to come back at the end of the Pierre's presentation to say a few more things, but hopefully based on your many questions. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Attila. Hello, everyone. And my apologies not to put on a video because my connection is really unstable. I don't want to be cut out. You can move to the next slide, Archana, please. So Attila has already given a very good background introduction to the why we have gone through this kind of research. So before we go into the finding, let's maybe remind us about the structure of the MICS and DHS questions. As has been mentioned, we are looking at both these major household survey programs, MICS and DHS, to see how the rates are doing. So the summary picture of the structure of the MICS questionnaire. As you see, we have in MICS a household questionnaire, which is basically the start, where we have one respondent on behalf of the household and adult, knowledgeable adult. And to this questionnaire is attached a water quality testing form. Then flowing out from the household questionnaire, basically we have a women questionnaire for women aged 15 to 49, which is usually all the women that have been listed as usual resident members of the household that has been selected. We have an under 5 questionnaires, which is looking at all under 5s that are usually residing in that household, and we interview the mother. And in the absence of the mother, if the mother is not a member of the household, we will talk to the caregiver. And this is all under 5s. And then we have a men's questionnaire for men 15 to 49, except in a few cases, sometimes the age bracket is a bit widened, but Standardly, this is 15 to 49. And most of the time, it's a subsample, all the men in every second or third household among the selected households. Then we have a 5 to 17 questionnaire, which is for children and adolescents aged 5 to 17. We interview the mother or in absence, the caregiver. And this is only one child selected per household at random. There's another questionnaire that's not actually mentioned here, but which we use some of the time, some to get information on immunization in health facilities when this information is not held at home on a card, but is held in the facilities. So that's it for the MICS. Next slide, please, Archana. So in this slide, we see the structure of the DHS questionnaire. And please, I take the opportunity to mention that I do not wish to stand at all as a DHS specialist. I'm really a person who has been doing work in MICS. So whatever I mentioned here about DHS is to the best of my knowledge, and I stand to be corrected if and I apologize if there's any incorrectness in what I'm going to say. But I believe this is pretty much as it is. So the DHS does have a household questionnaire, obviously, which is administered also to an adult member of the household, knowledgeable adult. And then there's a women questionnaire, similarly as we saw for the MICS, so for women aged 15 to 49, for all the eligible women identified in the interviewed household. There is then a men's questionnaire. Here, the more, let's say, flexible range, either 15 to 49 or up to 54 to 59 or even 64. And the DHS may use either a full sample or half sample of household in each clusters for the men's questionnaire. There are, as you will know, there's no under 5 questionnaire. This is one of the distinction between MICS and DHS. So the information about the under 5s, except for the anthropometry, except information about the under 5s is going to be done through the eligible women about their own under 5s, isn't it? So this means that under 5 children that are not, whose mother is not among those who have been selected for interview, those children, information is not collected on them, except for anthropometry, as I was mentioning, and other biomarkers possibly. So as we can see, there's a biomarker questionnaire. This is for anthropometry, hemoglobin. So it's for all children 0 to 4, for women and for men. And there is a remeasurement questionnaire. So in certain circumstances, which we are not going to go into details here, there is a remeasurement of for anthropometry of an under 5. And then there is, towards the left, you will see a field worker questionnaire, which is specific to the DHS. So that gives us an idea. They are in many ways similar, MICS and DHS, but there are some, as you can see, notable differences. Next slide, please.
We were left at this slide, so I will carry on from here very quickly. I hope I can do a good job in representing Pierre's presentation. So this slide was about defining what response rates are. Since we are looking at response rates over time in the 2 survey programs, then it's important to define how response rates are calculated, because this might have some variability between different household surveys and survey practitioners. In the case of both MICS and DHS has somewhat similar codes which are used here in this context. We are looking at finding out which households are occupied so that we can actually build the response rate on the basis of that. Therefore, the household response rate, for instance, is calculated as the number of completed households, completed interviews, divided by those households which are occupied. So from this calculation, from the denominator, we actually exclude some of the codes that you see there. For instance, if the entire household is absent for an extended period of time, which means that the household is not there for a long time and has a probability of being sampled elsewhere as well, we take that out. We also take out number 5, when we find out that the dwelling is vacant, or the address that has been given is actually not a dwelling. And we also exclude those dwellings which are destroyed, plus the other code, the cases which go into the other code. Now, these typically form, those which are excluded typically form a small amount, a small number of households in each survey, mainly or partly at least, depending on how well we have updated the sample frame before we actually start the fieldwork. So generally what we call the completion rate, which is the number of completed households divided by all households which have been selected, or the total sample size, is very close to the response rates. So if you can go to the next slide, based on this, we are going to start showing some of the results. The individual response rate, by the way, as Pierre mentioned before he was cut out, both survey programs have some commonalities as well. In addition to their questionnaires, one such area is the approach with which fieldwork is done. For instance, in the case of revisits to the households, but even more important is that in both cases, in both MICS and DHS surveys, there is a household questionnaire to start the actual interview in the household, but then eligible respondents or eligible topics are being selected to actually go into what we call individual questionnaires. And therefore, we are also able to calculate individual response rates, in which case the individual response rate, for instance, for women, for men, for 5 to 17s, for under 5s, etc., is the number of completed interviews divided by those who are eligible to be interviewed. And how do we know eligible, those who are eligible? From the list of the household members, from the household questionnaire, which has just been completed. One other difference, which is not very relevant to the analysis, the specific analysis that we have done here, is a difference in terms of who is included in the household list of the two programs. In the case of MICS, we use de jure household members to list in the household list, which are usual residents of the household. In the case of DHS, information on de facto household members, defined as those who slept the night before in the residence, are also included. If we are to calculate overall response rates, then we need to multiply individual response rates with household response rates. Next slide, please. So this slide introduces the number of surveys, the data that we have been using, as well as the trends over time. So for this analysis, 531 MICS and DHS surveys have been used for the household questionnaire, in other words, to calculate household response rates. 506 MICS and DHS surveys have been used to calculate response rates for the women's questionnaires, 284 for the men's questionnaires. And the next two, the under 5 questionnaire and the 5 to 17 questionnaire, we're only using MICS surveys because we don't have an equivalent questionnaire in the DHS surveys. There's in our sample for this analysis, we have 243 MICS surveys and 55 243 MICS surveys for the under 5 and 55 MICS surveys for the 5 to 17 questionnaires. If we go to the next slide, I think the next slide is, if I remember correctly, is summarizing the findings that you see on the graph. And as you can see here, oh, sorry, let's go back to the previous slide again, Archana. Yeah, as you can see here, this is combining both the MICS and DHS surveys and plotting on this graph the trends in the various questionnaires. As you can see, let me remind you or point out that the graph is scaled from 85% upwards. So in terms of the mean household and individual response rates in the two programs, none of the means of any of the questionnaires fall under 85%. The highest is the household questionnaire together with the under 5 questionnaire. As you can see, the mean household questionnaire response rates are increasing over time. At the beginning, then it's a little fall, but overall an increase at the last period as well. The same, more or less the same pattern we can see with women's questionnaires. In fact, for the surveys which have been conducted after 2020, which is not the majority of the data that we are looking at, the response rates for women's surveys on average have increased by 7%. And the lowest of these, and we know that in household surveys, men's questionnaires have a bad reputation of response. Even the men's questionnaires are in the area of 80s, upper 80s, then 90%, and the latest data is showing 93% of response rates in the men's questionnaires for the latest period. Next slide. This graph shows the MICS program separately. As you can see, there are very, very similar patterns as we saw in the previous slide. Again, for the latest period, or even for the 2015-19 period, we are looking at response rates which are well above 90%. Only in the case of men's questionnaire for the last preceding 2 periods, 5-year periods, we have 86% response rates as an average for the MICS program. And on the next slide, if you go to the next slide, for the DHS program, we see a similar pattern, again, increasing response rates for the men's questionnaires over time, as well as for the women's and men's, and no detection, maybe that is the main point that we want to make here, no detection of a falling trend on the average for all the surveys that we are taking into account over time for the 2 programs. Next slide. Now, for a number of slides that you're going to see in a minute, we are using actually box plots rather than these line graphs, so as to be able to see to show the range of the data that we have as well, in addition to the averages. The box in the middle will show, in the middle of it, there will be the median. The lower bound of the box is going to be showing the 25th percentile and the upper to 75th percentile. There will be some cases above the 75th percentile. And down below in those little circles, we're going to be looking at outliers in each case. So next slide, as a way of introduction on how to interpret the box plots. Next slide, please. Okay, this shows for the 531 MICS and DHS surveys, this shows the findings. As you can see, the boxes are all well within or in the upper 90s for the household response rates. In the graph, in the scale below, in the x-axis, you can see both MICS and DHS over time, as well as the number of surveys that we have included in this analysis. As you can see, for surveys which were conducted after 2020, the sample size is small, but for the other periods, we have a very large number of surveys. A few striking findings from here. One is there's no survey in either of the programs which have response rates below 70%. There are only 3 outlier surveys between 70 and 30% at the bottom of the graph, a handful of surveys, only a handful of surveys are between 80 and 90%, and all the rest are above 90%, and mostly above 95%, in fact. Next slide. This one looks at, this time, the women's response rates. In this case, we have 506 surveys that we have taken into account for this analysis. There's only one survey with individual response rates below 70%. Now, I should point out that this graph is showing both the individual response rates for women's questionnaires as well as the overall response rates, which is the multiplication of the women's individual response rate with the household response rate. So if we are looking at the left-hand side, which is the individual response rate, there's only one survey which is showing response rate below 70%. And at that, of course, very close to 70%, actually. Only a handful of surveys between 70 and 90%, and all the rest are above 90% once again. So very, very high response rates when it comes to individual response rates. But even when we take into account the overall response rates, which are almost always lower than the individual response rates, they also show that the large majority is about 80%, and most of them are above 90%. And over time, of course, you are seeing some more or less a summary of what we saw in the very first slide, where we are presenting with the line graph, more or less the trend over time too. Next slide, please. Okay, this one is showing urban, and so we thought, okay, we are seeing these very high response rates in both survey programs. There doesn't seem to be a huge difference between the two survey programs too. So why not look at urban and rural response rates? Because there's a general belief that urban response rates are much lower than rural response rates. And actually the crisis of non-response, so-called non-response, is actually mostly concentrated in urban areas. Therefore, we tried to break down all the data into urban and rural response rates for the MICS surveys. We haven't done this analysis, if I remember correctly, for DHS surveys. So we took all the surveys starting from round 4 of MICS, and we looked at urban and rural response rates separately. It is true, according to these findings, as you can see on the screen, the response rates tend to be higher in rural than urban areas. But the difference, as you can see, is not that great. Both the urban and the rural response rates are well above certain numbers of 90s, 95s in the case of all the questionnaires, as you can see. And for most surveys, urban response rates are within 5 percentage points of rural response rates. And since rural response rates are very high, you can imagine that the urban response rates are very high. And there's even some cases when we have lower response rates in the rural areas than urban areas. If you can click, I think there's going to be an additional slide graph on this one. Yes, this one actually shows the distribution of the differences between urban and rural response rates, and as you can see, mostly the differences are very small, concentrated over 0 on the x-axis of each of the questionnaires, and a few distributing around them. Next slide, please. Okay, how about fluctuations then over time for urban and rural households? Again, concentrating on MICS. It seems from what you see on the screen, which shows the household response rates for urban and rural areas for MICS, it seems that the gap between the urban and rural household response rates is small. small, and also, interestingly, it has remained quite stable over time. We don't see a widening of the gap in terms of response rates between urban and rural areas. So at least the thinking that urban response rates have been falling and rural response rates have been staying more or less stable over time is not actually seen in the data that we have looked at. The line in the middle, of course, is for the total, for the national total for each of the surveys, and the urban is below and rural is above. But as you can see, the difference between the two is not actually widening over time. Next, please. Another thinking that is quite prevalent is that the higher the income level of a country, the lower is the response rate. So we, in addition to looking at the urban and rural disaggregation of countries, within countries, we also looked at the income class of each of the country that we took into account, or each of the survey that we took into account for this analysis. For this to happen, we actually went to the date of the survey and we classified the survey as of the income class of the country at the time of the survey. So this does not show the income class that the survey or the country within which the survey was conducted belongs today, but the income class as of that time. And here on the screen, you see 4 categories: the low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries. Of course, high income countries are not that many. In both the DHS and MICS, we are primarily working in upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income countries. And it seems from here, from these findings, that the response rates tend to be higher in poorer than wealthier countries. That is true. But again, the difference is moderate. Next, please. We looked at this separately for MICS as well. The lower and lower middle income countries do have higher household response rates, as you can see on the screen. The upper middle and high income countries tend to have somewhat lower household response rates, but the main striking finding from this graph is that all of these rates, regardless of the income class of the countries, are remaining either stable or even slightly improving over time. Next, please. And the same, sorry, we have gone one more slide, one more back, please. Yeah, the same with DHS. If we look at the DHS for the household response rates by income classification, we have done the same classification for the DHS surveys, that the rates are high and stable and even improving over time. The upper middle income countries tend to have somewhat lower household response rates, which might be slightly decreasing over time, but that needs to be seen in the near future. So, next slide. So what have we been looking at here? Before actually concluding, I would like to say a few things about this analysis that we have done and what it stands for. One is, I think, that we are just scratching the surface of this interesting problem. As you know, response rates in household surveys are very important. Response rates are important, especially to the extent that they, because of the pattern within which response happens, may introduce bias. Low response rates on themselves, on its own, does not necessarily mean that bias has been introduced into a survey, because non-response may be at random as well. So that's a concern. Therefore, hence, there's a lot of work in the literature which is looking at non-response or response behavior to see how non-responders compare, for instance, with those who respond, or whether non-response is being concentrated on certain groups of populations. Nevertheless, having very high response rates, such as those that we are seeing in the MICS and DHS programs, is an assurance to begin with that most likely, very, very likely, the non-response, the small amount of non-response that we get in these two survey programs is likely not to be introducing a significant amount of bias. But there needs to be some work even to look at that small part of non-response. This is just looking at the two survey programs to see if this commonly held belief that household surveys have plunging response rates is applicable to these two survey programs. And it seems from this analysis, and we are just scratching the surface here, it seems from this analysis that that is not true for the time being. In fact, there doesn't seem to be a discernible trend from what we have seen that household response rates or individual response rates have been declining over time. If anything, we have been seeing in some of the questionnaires some gradual increases in response rates. The last point that I wanted to make here is that response rates are usually thought of or function of the behavior of the responders and not of the data collectors. I think it is very important to note that response rates, non-response, including being able to access households and the individuals, including the way that households are revisited for interviews, including the way that the fieldwork is organized, including the way that the fieldwork is supervised and monitored, are all factors which have a huge impact on response and non-response. Generally, what we are seeing in the literature is that non-response is usually equated with refusals, which is not the case. Non-response is formed with behavior other than just refusals in household surveys. So it seems from this analysis that for the time being, it seems that for the two survey programs and in the countries that these two survey programs operate in, which are primarily low income, lower middle income and upper middle income countries with a few high income countries, there's no need for panic at this point in time, which does not mean that we are not going to get this kind of problem in the near future. There's more work to be done on this. There's much more work, actually, as I mentioned. This is just scratching the surface. We need to look at within these surveys, each of the surveys, do a little bit of more microanalysis to look at different groups with their behaviors, and there's some interesting research work that can be done to see to explain even further which factors, if any, are influencing non-response behavior in the MICS surveys and DHS surveys. So I'll stop there and see if Pierre is able to join, whether he can say something. Otherwise, Archana, we can probably open it to questions and answers.
Yes, thank you, Attila. I've been on the back channel speaking with Pierre, texting, and he's unable to unmute himself. We've tried several rounds of this. I'm not sure what the issue is, so we'll just carry on. And I'm sure if there's anything, Pierre, I think you can hear us. You can also just write some responses to the questions in the Q&A box as well. So why don't we continue with the Q&A?
So while I was during the presentation, of course, I haven't been able to look at the questions which came.
Sure.
Q&A. So you will have to have the patience for me to look at those. But anyone, I mean, Archana, Pierre, if you can help me with that, I would be really happy. Okay. That's a very good question to begin with. If referring to response rate per module or topic, that's a very good question. In this analysis, we haven't looked at it, but it can be easily done. Let me form the distinction. The one distinction that we can do is actually unit non-response or unit response and item response or non-response. When it comes to item non-response, we can actually talk about a module, a topic, but mostly I think item non-response is thought of in terms of questions. We have not looked at that in this analysis, but we do know that through our various work that we have been doing in the MICS program, that item non-response, with the exception of a couple of specific topics in the very near future, in very recent years, and it will be applicable in the near future as well, I think, is very high item response. In fact, we do have a protocol to make sure that any missing value from any data, any question should not be above 5%. If there's, it's a way that we approach the data to look at and ascertain data quality to make sure that those missing values are well below 5%, and we do have very low item non-response in MICS surveys. However, there has been a couple of cases in the very recent years where we have realized, we have been seeing that a couple of items, we might have a little bit higher or unwanted item non-response, primarily in the case of anthropometry in some countries, and in some cases in the case of the foundational learning skills module that we have been using, which is about interviewing children themselves. So other than those, I don't think item non-response is much of a problem in the DHS and MICS surveys at this point. Another question I'm looking at, which is what causes a fall in response rates? Why do urban and high-income households have higher non-response rates? It's a million-dollar question, I would think. As I explained, I think response rates are a function of both the data collectors and the respondents, and not entirely related to the characteristics of the responding households. That's one thing to put aside, as I mentioned before. There's if you look at the literature, there's several explanations for this. There's issues of privacy, the increasing privacy in societies, urbanization and increasing isolation of households from each other, increasing crime in some urban areas, and we are seeing even in some upper middle income countries that when there's crime rates which are high, then the response rates tend to be lower. We are seeing in some countries, in some urban areas, gated communities, for instance, where access is almost impossible. We do know that those households are occupied, but we cannot really access them. So there's many different reasons for non-response. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that in terms of what the data collectors are putting in place to make sure that response rates are high, response rates are also somewhat maybe related to the content or the subject matter of the survey and the identity of the data collectors too. I think households, individuals respond in different ways to different profiles of the data collectors. In our case, for instance, UNICEF collecting data or a survey by government, which is what we do, but has a UNICEF collaboration on it, has a very good reputation, and therefore I think we have an inbuilt probability of increased response rates in our surveys. So there are many aspects of this, many factors that explain this. So those are some of the things that we need to look at in further work. Let's see if there are other other questions. Okay, if response rate per module were examined, no, not in this work that we have done, as I mentioned earlier. The investigators actually administered the questionnaires to the targeted households, and how do you manage recruitment bias? Well, these are also $1 million questions, I would think. Well, we have put in place, I can talk on behalf of the MICS program, but I do know that the DHS program has also very sophisticated, elaborate ways of supervising or monitoring the collection of data in the field. We have developed a number of protocols and a number of ways during the fieldwork data collection to ensure that we are going to the right households, in keeping response rates high, interviewing the right people, etc. Usually people think of manipulation of data or the famous under the tree questionnaire completion. It is very rare, if not non-existent in most situations. There are other types of data quality problems that might arise from the fieldwork if good supervision and monitoring of the fieldwork is not done. For instance, just one example, and I will move on. We collect data we can see the data nowadays every single day coming from the field, and we can actually perform data quality analyses on all the data which is coming, thanks to the current technology in being able to transfer all the data to the cloud. So there are visits to the field, there are supervisors who have different roles, there are interviewers. There's a lot that has been done in the case of fieldwork organization, so that ensures that these kinds of problems are virtually non-existent in household surveys of this type. Recruitment bias, that's a good question. In the case of MICS, of course, the recruitment is a responsibility of the national governments who conduct the surveys. It's their surveys, it's not UNICEF surveys. We have a number of recommendations on what the profile of an interviewer should look like, and we try to make sure that the interviewers that we are using in the MICS surveys are actually consistent with those profiles. Other than that, it is mainly the responsibility of the national statistical offices in terms of making sure that we get the right the interviewer profiles. Is analysis implemented traditionally, or is there a contribution from other resources? Yeah, this is probably referring to the analysis that Pierre has done. No, the analysis was implemented traditionally with using the data coming from the both survey programs. The MICS and DHS are both face-to-face surveys, but telephone interviews have been introduced as follow-ups. In MICS, I believe, how does different modes impact item and unit non-response? Again, very good question, which might have a long answer, but let me try to address it to the best that I can. It is true that we have now introduced in the MICS program a new initiative called the MICS Plus, which is basically taking the MICS responding households and selecting a subsample from them and continuing to collect data from those households by phone calls to the households in the simplest form, let's say. The response rates in the MICS Plus surveys, and we don't have many examples of this. We started the MICS Plus, the first MICS Plus surveys were conducted when the COVID crisis was still on in Mongolia and Georgia. In the first few surveys, especially when there were lockdowns and life had not returned to normal in these countries, response rates tended to be very, very high. We are sensing, and we have all the data, of course, that with more mixed plus surveys happening, we have, I think, 5 or 6 more of them which have been happening. The response rates seem to be lower than the initial 2 surveys. However, I think to be able to conclude on this, we have to have many more surveys to look at, because some of those countries that we have been doing mixed plus surveys are actually the countries who had relatively lower response rates to begin with in the mixed surveys themselves. So it would be good to look at that trend with more data coming in from mixed plus. But overall, I could say that despite being a phone survey, mixed plus, compared to the traditional random digit dialing type of surveys that you see in the literature, that we have very high response rates still. I think I addressed the issue of the rural versus urban response rates. Of course, there's how do we cope with the effect of this differential response rate? Basically, urban and rural areas or households coming from these 2 different areas are actually we actually do corrections for response during the calculation of the sample weights. So in the end, if there's whether or not there's any difference between urban and rural areas in terms of the response rates, we actually have a way of reflecting the effect of differential response rates onto the sample. So there's therefore some correction, if you like, at the end for this type of differential response. Okay, I'm trying to see the next question. I think Bo has answered one question. He wants to flag also the effect of conducting a high quality mapping and listing operation before the survey, which is very important. I sort of alluded to this earlier in the context of the completion rate, but it is true that in terms of efficiency and controlling cost and also morale of the team, I think it is really important to do a good updating or listing of the sample frame before the actual survey fieldwork starts, so that we're on better ground with the data collected. To follow up on the comments about response rates in gated communities, are there any plans to adjust the methodology for calculating certain indicators which are directly affected by this? Specifically, household with a place for hand washing. Well, yes, we haven't made those kinds of changes or modifications with respect to any of the indicators in the mix when it comes to non-response, because as you have seen, the level of non-response is very, very low. Now that our colleague Jacqueline has referred to hand washing, we saw with a lot of interest, and maybe that was another item that I should have maybe mentioned together with anthropometry and foundational learning. That's another item that sometimes, in some cases, has higher item non-response. And this happens, it has been happening a lot, and this is just an impression, and we have to look at this in more detail, as I mentioned earlier, together with Pierre later, that I have seen in countries, especially where there's prevalent crime rates, that item non-response, especially with regard to questions which necessitate the interviewer to see the inside of the house or to do the interview in the house and be able to observe, then the item non-response may go up in some cases. But no, we haven't done any changes to any on the basis of this. How can you ensure the reliability of the answers? We have a lot of data quality checks that we do, and we try to make sure that we have good quality data overall, not only with respect to not response, but much wider than that. If we narrow down the response rates analysis based on admin levels in the country or time of survey, could we get the same scenario? Yes, I think we could. Definitely we could, and we can. That's a good idea. We can actually look into that with more specificity. Any specific characteristics that can be shared about outliers? Yes, we can. We do, of course, do have them. Unfortunately, Pierre is not able to speak, but we do have the names of those surveys, obviously. This topic, by the way, is going to lead into a MICS methodological paper. We have a methodological paper series for many years now, and this we intend to publish this in that series as part of the series, and if possible, maybe we're going to be including the names of some of the countries. And I hope that, and of course I cannot talk on behalf of Pierre, but I hope that we will be able to do a little bit more country-specific analysis in the next iteration of work that we do on this topic. Misunderstanding of household concept, which makes data collection too different, because in our country, the couples, those still living within their parents, with their parents in the same courtyard to account themselves as one household. Okay, I get the point. Thank you very much for the question. There's a specific household definition that we use in MICS surveys, and I believe in DHS surveys too. What we do is that in the case of MICS, we try to use as best possible the household definition which is used in the country, because the definition of household is quite variable from one to the other. But in the example that is being given here, like different households living in the same compound but in different courtyards, etc., there's protocols on how to handle that. And if we go to one address as part of the sample, and we find that by using certain criteria, this is sort of standard in a way, generic, which applies to almost all the countries. If you find that there's more than one household, depending on a number of criteria, for instance, their cooking is separate, their income is separate, that kind of thing, then we consider them as more than one household, and we collect data from all those households, regardless of the initial sampling that was done. Randomizations to minimize bias. Well, if there was much less response in the case of MICS, of course, we would be using a lot of reweighting and other kind of techniques or calibration or other kind of techniques to do this to account for the bias. But I don't think we have that kind of problem at this point. Is the MICS covering all SDG health-related indicators? Although this is not mainly related to the topic at present, we are collecting a lot of SDG health-related indicators, but not all, obviously. I don't think there's any program, any survey which can actually collect all of the SDG health-related indicators. Could there be an increase over time on some of the item response rates? Could be. We have to look into that. Specific topics like sexual behavior, it is possible. I see that the question is coming from Gislan. It is true. There might be more openness to such questions over time. But also, may I also once again, and I use this example a lot, maybe over time, we have also been educated in how to ask these questions and how not to ask these questions. I do remember, and I'm not going to mention the name of another survey program, not MICS, not DHS, another survey program, well, where a sensitive topic on sexual violence was approached in the early days from a very, very problematic angle in terms of privacy, in terms of confidentiality of data, in terms of the actual approach to the respondent to be able to get to build a rapport and get the best possible responses from the respondent. And it was very problematic in the beginning, and then it was corrected, it was modified and improved. So I think there's some learning which has been happening on our side, and also there's some evolution, some changes in the society at large in terms of being able to tend to answer these questions. But there's also the opposite argument that as the level of privacy and confidentiality and personal space and isolation of households and the urban arrangement, the urban life, which requires all of these, of course, or imposes all of these, because of these, respondents might be even more reluctant to answer these questions. So that may be related to some research that we might be doing in the future on item non-response as well. Okay, I don't see any other questions if I'm not missing anything. Archana?
Either do I, Attila. I think you've answered actually every single one. Does
Okay.
anybody have any last minute questions before we sign off? All right.
Pierre, I think, is still not able to connect. Is that correct?
No, unfortunately, I was just going to mention that apologies to everybody, and especially Pierre, for not being able to come back on and answer some of the questions. But I want to thank you, Pierre, as well as Attila, for this presentation, and also for the excellent questions and comments in the chat. And we appreciate your attendance here today. Just a reminder that the next webinar will be taking place on March 20th. That's 2 weeks from now at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic is MICS GIS, harnessing the power of geolocation data. So we're hoping you'll be able to join us for that as well. Another reminder that recordings are available on the MICS YouTube channel, as well as internally on the UNICEF SharePoint site. And we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Everyone.